Hello, fellow Formula One fans. This is the Casual Fan. So let's do it. Bahrain Grand Prix 2022. The first race of the season is at the doorsteps now, and we cannot be more excited about it. The race is going to kickstart what is going to be a very interesting season, and probably, well, if we are fair, this might just be the start of an entirely new era in Formula One. So before the 5 lights go out, in this video you get all that you need to know about the Bahrain Grand Prix, and then in the end I will give my predictions. So first we talk about what has changed since last season, then we take a look at the Bahrain GP form guide and see who is in form and who isn't. Then we will be looking at a few key storylines before the race, and then in the end I will give my predictions for the weekend. So without further ado, let's jump straight to it. Well, first of all, the new season is also the start of a new era in Formula One. An entirely new and different set of regulations have been introduced, and it remains to be seen which team has conclusively made the jump over the rest of the grid. However, it's not only the cars that look different, there's changes all over the place this season. First, the tires. Formula One is introducing an entirely different iteration of tires for the new generation of cars. The 18-inch rim tires are going to replace the standard 13-inch Pirellis we used to have until last season. Now, early verdict on these tires, the drivers didn't seem to mind it too much, and the tires have so far received a positive feedback. Now after tires, even the drivers. Yes, the team lineups have changed a bit since we last raced. George Russell has replaced Valtteri Bottas at Mercedes, Guan Yu Zhou makes his debut at Alfa Romeo, Nikita Mazepin is no more part of the grid, thankfully, while Kevin Magnussen makes a return to Formula One in the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now talking about the rules, well, there are two that stand out for now. Remember what happened at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, where Michael Massey selectively moved the 5 cars between Max and Lewis out of the way by allowing only them to unlap themselves? Well, you can't do that anymore. From now onwards, all lapped cars will be allowed to overtake whenever it is deemed safe enough for the lapped cars to unlap themselves. The second and probably the more relevant rule that got removed is the mandate that the cars in Q3 had to start the race on the tires on which they did their fastest lap in Q2. While in the past this rule did used to throw a factor of variability in the race, but I feel it was slightly unfair to the drivers that had just scraped through to Q3. The new rule, well, it does bring a sense of equitability in the race, and well, I do prefer that as compared to what used to happen last season. Plus, to add to it, you might see different teams opting for different tires at the start of the race, and that might throw in some new strategies that, well, we didn't see in the last season. Now talking about the car, well, other than the visual changes that do seem obvious, there are some changes in the characteristics as well. The first is the reintroduction of ground effect after almost 30 years, and it does appear that it helps the cars to follow the other cars without losing too much downforce. The cars should ideally be around a second per lap slower than last season, but will now be much quicker in the fast speed corners, and well, they will lose out in the slower speed as compared to how they were in the last season. It still remains to be seen, however, if the new generation of cars will make overtaking easier or not, because the jury is, well, it's still out on that. Okay, now with that out of the way, now let's look at the Bahrain GP form guide, and well, let's have a look at which team looks good before the Bahrain Grand Prix and which are the teams that could probably struggle heading into the first race of the season. Now, after the pre-season testing that ended a week before the Bahrain Grand Prix, the pecking order does not look as clear as it used to in the previous seasons. It's hard to make a definitive pick on where everyone fits in this jigsaw puzzle. But if early impressions are anything to go by, then Ferrari and Red Bull appear to be leading the charge. Ferrari was the undisputed champion of testing until the last day when Red Bull's new aero upgrade bumped Ferrari down the order. Although there are still question marks on whether Ferrari was running the car lighter than the others, it does appear that the Italian team has put together a good challenger, and for the first race of the season, if there are any teams that can be expected to lead the charge at the front, then well, it's going to be Red Bull and Ferrari. Mercedes turned heads when it introduced what could be termed a slightly novel and out-of-the-box solution to the new regulations. The no side pod Mercedes stands out on the entire grid because of the way the German team has approached the new regulations. But, well, if we are honest, when it comes to lap times and how the car is behaving on the track, the reviews are not that positive. It does appear that the team still needs to do a lot of work to understand how to extract the performance from the car. Can they complete all that work in just 1 week before the Bahrain Grand Prix? Well, Mercedes was able to do it last season. If you remember, they struggled a lot during the pre-season testing, even last season as well. But in the end, when it came to the first race of the season, Mercedes won that race. But then the last season did not have Ferrari as a contender as well, and a completely new set of regulations that makes it tough to catch up. I think this is the worst condition we have seen Mercedes in since the start of the turbo era in 2014. And it will be interesting to see if the German team can turn it around for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's look at some of the key storylines before the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now first of all, who has the fastest car? For now, it does appear that Red Bull and Ferrari have stolen the march from the rest of the grid. The two teams have put together different ideologies while designing their cars, but still came up with what seems to be pretty good solutions. However, it still remains to be seen where Red Bull, Ferrari, and especially Mercedes stack up on the grid in terms of performance. The early impressions after the pre-season test indicate a pecking order of Red Bull, Ferrari, and then Mercedes. But the thing is, it's hard to make a conclusion based on testing because engine modes and fuel loads are probably some of the biggest variables that need to be accounted for. It will also be interesting to see where Mercedes finds itself in all of this, as they do have a huge question mark on their performance after, well, I won't call it disastrous. It was probably a not so productive pre-season for the team. I guess the final verdict of where the teams are, I think we all have to wait for Q3 at Bahrain to ultimately find out the relative performance of each team. It was probably an even bigger anomaly after the pre-season to see the way the midfield appeared to stack up. From 5th until 9th, it's hard to make a definitive pick of where the teams are in the pecking order. The gaps during testing were so minuscule between the teams, and what it did reveal was a scenario where the onus will be on the drivers to pull out the lap that counts. However, where do these teams stand in the pecking order, and how far behind are they from the frontrunners? These are probably some of the more curious questions that need to be answered, and I think we have to wait for Bahrain's qualifying to ultimately find out the answers to these questions. I think the third most important question that everyone will be wondering right now is what kind of impact will the new regulations have on overtaking? Because, well, the biggest selling point of these regulations is the fact that it helps the cars to follow each other closer than what they used to in the previous regulations. So talking about the early impressions from drivers, it reveals that the new generation of cars are easier to follow as compared to the previous generation. However, to counter that, there is also skepticism around the reduced impact of slipstreaming as well. What is the overall impact of these new regulations? It's probably going to need the race at Bahrain and a few others to finally understand if there are any improvements to wheel-to-wheel racing as compared to what we had in the last few seasons. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's move to, well, the most interesting part of the video, the predictions for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now, the first race of the season is the trickiest when it comes to making predictions. We haven't really seen either of these cars pushed with lightest of fuels on board, so we don't have a definite clue of where these cars stand heading into the Bahrain Grand Prix. However, if lap times and the way the cars look on track is anything to go by, it does appear that the tentative order is Red Bull, Ferrari, and Mercedes. Red Bull seems to hold the edge heading into the first race of the season, and if that is the case, it makes sense to hedge our bets and put our money on Max Verstappen for winning the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now, talking about the team that might surprise the most, I think if there was one thing that stood out during the pre-season tests in Bahrain, then it was the competitiveness of the Haas F1 Challenger. The team has gone through a lot in 2021 as it gave up on the season to mount an all-out charge on the new regulations. The car, well, until now it looks great whenever it's out on track. Its lap times look even better if you take a closer look. For a team that was a legitimate backmarker for an entire season, in my view, Haas is going to surprise everyone in this race and score points at the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now, talking about the driver that will surprise everyone, well, one battle that everyone seems to be sleeping on before the Bahrain Grand Prix is the intra-team battle between George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. Either out of respect for Lewis or at the risk of not hyping Russell up too much, the media has been on the fence when it comes to looking at the potential battle between the two Mercedes teammates. In my view, Russell belongs to the big stage, and at the Bahrain Grand Prix he is going to surprise a few people in the paddock. It's hard to predict whether Russell will beat Lewis, but I do expect him to be very close to his teammate throughout the race and prove to the paddock that he does belong amongst the top drivers on the grid. Now, talking about the team that will disappoint, well, the new regulations were supposed to be the trigger to Williams returning back to the midfield. The team had a perfect launchpad with the 2021 season featuring points and a podium. Yet, according to the pre-season tests, it doesn't seem to have put together a challenger capable enough of fighting even in the midfield. And in my view, with a weakened driver lineup and what looks like a suboptimal challenger, Williams might just prove to be the biggest disappointment of the weekend. And finally, talking about the driver that is going to disappoint, well, Daniel Ricciardo needs a strong season at McLaren in 2022. However, the Australian driver has been forced to miss the pre-season test because of COVID. And for a driver that needed a perfect pre-season, this surely wasn't one. At the Bahrain Grand Prix, expecting Ricciardo to be back to full fitness and already adapted to the McLaren is going to be a tough ask. In my view, Ricciardo is going to struggle massively during the Bahrain GP weekend and is going to be the biggest disappointment of the weekend. So these are my views and my predictions. What do you guys think? Who are you backing to win the Bahrain Grand Prix? Do drop your views in the comment section and please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching and see you next time.